The command came before dawn when the forge hall still slept beneath its blanket of ash and silence. The air tasted of soot and waiting, then the great horn sounded and the students came flooding in, claws scraping, hooves stomping, wings brushing the stone rafters. As they took their places around the pits, the instructors stood in a line, their faces lit by the first breath of flame from the central furnace, their eyes sharp, their voices low, until one of them stepped forward and spoke the command that made the walls seem to hum. "Today, you will forge blades." The words struck the class like sparks from the anvil. Some hissed in excitement, some whispered in fear, because this was the test that marked the passage from learning to becoming, and none who failed would stand among the warriors of the order again. They were told to create not just a weapon but a truth of themselves in steel, to pour their will into molten metal and draw it out shaped and alive. Each student was given a bar of raw ore and a measure of coal, and they bowed low before the flame as the instructors began to chant. The fire roared higher as if answering the coal, the sound thick and alive like the breathing of some ancient beast. It filled the hole with its rhythm until the air shimmered and sweat began to gather. On every brow, the students began to move their bodies, finding the dance they had been taught from childhood. Swing, strike, turn, cool, repeat. The sound of hammer against anvil grew into thunder, and the floor seemed to tremble with the heartbeat of the forge. They worked with the wild joy that came from knowing they were shaping their futures, each strike a promise of power and belonging. Their claws and paws and hands gleamed orange. From reflected heat, sparks flew like fireflies caught in a storm. Some sang as they worked, deep, growling tones that rose above the hammers echoing against the walls. Others grunted or muttered, their focus pure and unbroken. This was not craft, this was ritual, and each blow was prayer. The instructors moved among them, watching, correcting, nodding, a word here, a gesture there. They smelled the air, the metal, the sweat, the determination, and smiled faintly. It was good. The forge was alive. The far end of the hall, near the shadowed walls, stood one figure who did not yet move, the human smaller than most, thinner hands, bare, no scales, no fur, no claws, only pale skin, and a quiet that seemed to draw the heat instead of radiating it. They watched the others with wide eyes, their breath shallow as if the air itself pressed against them. The instructor saw and said nothing, for the test would reveal what words could not. The human looked at the bar of ore in their hands, heavy, dull, and lifeless. The metal reflected the fire but gave nothing back, and something in them stirred, a thought faint and uncertain like the flicker of a flame in wind. They glanced at the others, at their perfect rhythm, their practiced power, and felt a strange stillness in their chest, a question forming, unspoken. If the blade must reflect the soul, then what should they forge from silence? The horn sounded again, marking the beginning of the task. The hammers fell in unison, and the forge roared, but the human did not lift their hammer. They stood with the weight of the ore in their hands and the whisper of their own heart louder than the fire around them. Something old was waiting at the edge of that silence, and it would not be forged in steel. The forge hole erupted as the hammers fell like thunder, each blow a heartbeat in the body of the forge. The fire grew wild, and golden tongues of heat licked the air, filling the space with the roar of creation. The students worked in furious rhythms, sparks bursting and dying in showers of orange light that drifted across scales, fur, and skin. The scent of molten iron, thick enough to taste in the throat. The hum of power rose higher until it drowned every thought but the one that said forge. The students became creatures of motion. They swung their hammers with the precision of soldiers and the fervor of believers. Each strike shaped not just the metal but the self behind it, muscles, coiled breath, timed to the rhythm of the glowing blades. Some bit their lips until they bled, others laughed, wild and fearless, their voices cracking under the heat, but no one stopped. This was the trial that separated those born of strength from those pretending to hold it. The sound of steel striking steel became the language of ambition and fear. One student with horns like broken antlers let out a battle cry as their blade began to take form, the edge glowing white. The instructors nodded at the display of control, while another student with feathers along their arms beat their wings to cool the metal with gusts of wind, a creature of ice and breath, their every movement measured and sure. And still another student, still another student, whose eyes burned amber, poured oil over the blade to give it a mirrored shine that caught every flicker of light. The forge was not just a place of labor, it was theater, and every stroke a performance. Human watched from the edge of this storm, their face pale beneath the dancing light. They felt the heat rise and the ground tremble beneath them, their hands tightening around the lump of ore that still had no shape. It felt raw, heavy, dead, as if it resisted them at every thought. Their heart kept pace with the hammer song, but they could not move. Their breath grew short, the air too thick to draw. They could smell the burning of metal and hair and pride, and yet they stood unmoving. Scaled instructor turned to look at them, their gaze sharp as a blade, and for a moment the human thought they would be called out, shamed, before the class, but the instructor only turned away, leaving them to the silence between struts. So the human wandered closer to the other forgers, trying to find meaning in their rhythm, to see what they could not feel. They saw how the others listened to the metal, how they read its song and obeyed its will, but to the human the iron spoke nothing. It only stared back, cold and heavy. It turned away, stepping through the haze toward the outer wall where old tools rested, broken and forgotten among cracked stones. Their footsteps faded beneath the storm of hammers until even their presence seemed to disappear. They passed a rack of failed blades, blackened and twisted, the smell of burnt oil and defeat clinging to them. Something tugged at their mind, an impulse, old and soft, like memory. They followed it toward the darker corner beyond the glow of the forges, where the heat gave way to chill and shadow behind. Then the storm raged on, laughter and challenge and triumph all clashing together. But ahead the quiet waited like an open hand. The human hesitated once, looking back at the sea of sparks, flying like stars torn from the sky, and then they stepped into the dark, letting the light fall away. That quiet, the sound of hammers became distant and hollow like rain on a faraway roof, and the human felt their chests loosen for the first time since the horn had sounded. They could breathe again, and though they did not yet know what they sought, they could feel it was not made of steel. The human stood in the dimness at the edge of the forge hall, where the glow from the fires softened and broke into long fingers of red that reached across the stone floor. They watched the others move within the light, their shapes bending and shifting like creatures born from the flame. The rhythm of their hammers struck through the air, steady, relentless, the kind of sound that demanded all attention. Yet the human listened past it to the smaller noises, the hiss of cooling metal, the crackle of coals, the sighs between blows, the whispers of tired breath. They felt small among them, the others, their borders wide and strong, their hands sure, their eyes bright with heat and purpose. The human's own hand seemed fragile, too soft, too light. They turned the piece of ore over and over, feeling its dead weight, its stubborn silence. They tried to imagine it alive, to picture it glowing, but the image slipped away like smoke. No matter how they tried, their mind did not hold it, and instead their thoughts drifted toward the scent of old stone and dust that lingered near the outer walls. They remembered stories whispered before sleep in the barracks, about the forge halls below the main one where relics of old wars rested and forgotten, and about the first blades, made not from metal but from what could be found, bone, stone, claw, things shaped by necessity, not glory. The human had always listened closely to those stories while the others laughed and spoke of honor and strength. Something about those quiet beginnings had stayed with them like a seed in the dark, waiting for the right silence to grow. The heat was too much near the center of the hall. The air shimmered and stung their eyes, so they moved toward the shadows, drawn by a coolness that seemed to breathe from the stone itself. They walked past racks of tools, their handles worn smooth from use, past barrels of quenching oil that smelled sharp and old, until the glow behind them faded into a dim heartbeat of light. The sound of hammers softened, but did not vanish. It echoed faintly like a memory of thunder through walls of distance. In that half-light the human saw shelves and boxes filled with scraps, broken pieces of iron, cracked stone shapes that might once have been tools or art, and beneath one table, bones long pale and twisted, a relic of something once alive. The sight stopped them. The air shifted around them, colder and stiller, as if the room held its breath. The human knelt, reaching out a careful hand to touch the bone. It was cool beneath their fingers, smoother than it looked, with tiny lines running across it like veins of forgotten stories. They turned it slowly, the light catching faint patterns along its curve. Something inside them stirred. Recognition, perhaps old memory. Though they could not name it, it felt right, more alive than the ore that had weighed their hands. The bone did not resist. It seemed to hum faintly beneath their touch, a song too quiet for others to hear. They stayed there for a long time, not moving, only tracing the lines with their fingertips while the forge roared behind them, the noise of creation and ambition fading to a distant storm. They did not feel apart from the others, nor against them, only elsewhere. Caught between two songs, one of fire and one of quiet, they looked once more toward the glow at the far end of the hall, where sparks still rose and fell like brief stars, then back to the bone resting against their palm. They knew without words that their place was here, in the cool edge of shadow where silence held its own kind of heat. and the shape of their blade was waiting not in the ore but in the memory of the hunt. The human rose from where they knelt and the bone lay across their palms. Like a secret, the air round them heavy and cool, their breath steady. Now while behind them the forge raged with heat and thunder, the others still worked, their hammers crashing like waves against the shore. Their laughter rough and bright, they called out to one another, boasting of sparks and strength, but the human heard none of it clearly, for the sound of the bone beneath their touch seemed louder in a way that had no voice. They moved deeper into the dimness toward where the walls curved, and the floor sloped downward into a place few ever went. The light from the main fires reached this far only as a dull red haze, more smoke than glow. The stones were colder, the air thinner. Each step took them away from the world of fire and noise, into a stillness that felt alive. The human could feel the weight of that silence pressing close around their shoulders like a cloak. It did not frighten them, it steadied them. They stopped at a low table covered in dust and old tools, their metal dark and soft from years of sleep. They placed the bone upon it and brushed away the dust. The shape of it gleamed faintly even in the weak light, a curve of white like the crescent of a small moon. They ran a finger along its surface, feeling the faint rise of ridges and the smooth valley between them. It felt both fragile and strong, ancient yet awake. The human leaned closer and saw small marks, not scratches but lines carved long ago by something patient and deliberate. They could not tell if it was work of hand or claw, but they felt sure it had meaning. Perhaps once it was part of something larger, or a rib maybe, or a limb from some creature whose name was lost to time. But the moment they held it, the human knew it had purpose. It wanted to be shaped again, not remade but remembered. The air in this place smelled of stone and age, not of fire and metal. The sound of dripping water came from somewhere unseen, soft and rhythmic. It reminded the human of the pulse of a sleeping heart. They found a piece of whetstone among the scattered tools and sat cross-legged beside the bone. They did not think about what they were doing. They only began to move the stone gently across the curve of bone. The rasping sound, sharp at first, then smooth and steady like breathing dust, rose pale and fine and clung to their fingers. The bone began to take on a sheen beneath their careful work. Each motion small, deliberate, almost reverent. They forgot the time, forgot the noise behind them, forgot the tests and the expectations and the stories of steel and flame. There was only this act, this quiet carving of something that already knew its shape, waiting to be uncovered. That moments they paused to lift the bone and tilt it toward the faint glow above its surface, caught the dim light and returned it with a ghostly shimmer, soft but certain. The sound of the forge grew distant like thunder receding beyond hills. The human did not feel apart now, but aligned with something older, deeper than the forge. They realized that not all blades were born from fire. Some came from patience and memory, from the will to listen rather than strike. When they set the bone down again, their reflection shimmered faintly upon its surface, and they smiled. Without knowing why, for the first time since the command had been spoken, they felt they were no longer waiting, they were beginning. The humans sat in the quiet with the bone resting across their knees, the faint shimmer of dust still floating through the air like thin threads of smoke. The forge behind them had dimmed to a distant roar, the rhythm of hammers now only a memory. In the stones the silence felt different now, not empty but full, like breath held before word. They turned the bone over in their hands again, tracing the edge that had begun to form beneath their touch. The whetstone lay beside them, dull and worn, but the surface of the bone gleamed as if it carried its own faint light. They leaned close to the shape, running their thumb along the curve, and felt how it caught the skin, not sharp yet, but promising a whisper of what it could become. They smiled, though they did not know why. It was not pride, not victory, only recognition, as if they had found something they had lost long ago, and the act of shaping it was not creation but remembrance. The air smelled of dust and faint marrow, the scent not unpleasant but earthy, grounding. The human breathed it in and exhaled slowly. They could hear the faint drip of water somewhere beyond the wall, steady and patient, the sound aligning with the motion of their hand as they lifted the whetstone again and drew it across the bone in slow, deliberate strokes. The rasping filled the quiet, a soft song of friction and intention, each motion carving away the roughness, revealing the truth hidden beneath. Time did not move here, it only stretched. The forge fire from afar rose and fell, the light shifting across the walls, but the human worked as if outside its reach. Their shoulders ached, their fingers raw, but they did not stop. The bone seemed to guide them, telling them where to press, where to ease. It felt alive and listening, as if remembering the creature it once was, or perhaps the hands that now shaped it into something new. At times, They paused and lifted it to the faint red light. It reflected in uneven glimmers. Across its curve, the edge, faintly translucent like ice, and beneath the surface thin lines ran like veins or cracks of light. They followed them with their gaze and felt again that quiet certainty that this was not rebellion but return, while the others forged from heat and command. The human forged from memory and choice. From the far end of the hall, a voice called out, laughter echoing through the arches, but the human did not lift their head. They heard the mocking tone faint beneath the laughter, though they did not catch the words. It did not matter. The sound belonged to another world, a world of heat and fire and expectation. Here in the quiet, the human had found a new rhythm, softer, slower, truer. When the edge finally caught the light, clean and steady, the human stopped. The bone lay smooth and pale in their hands, no longer raw or broken, but something more, a promise of both life and death balanced in the same breath. The human felt their pulse steady, felt their breath matched the drip of distant water, and the world narrowed to this single piece of shaped silence. They rose slowly, the stiffness in their body reminding them how long they had worked, and when they looked toward the glow of the forges they could see the smoke curling higher through the roof vents streaked with orange and gold. The sound of the others still fierce and alive, but to the human it seemed far away, like a song already fading into memory. They looked down at the bone once more, and the decision settled deep inside. Then they would bring this to the test. They would not hide it, for the bone was their blade and their truth. Hall never slept. It only breathed slower as night folded over its flames. The students still worked, their hammers falling softer now but steady like rain on stone, the air thick with the scent of sweat and iron and smoke. Yet beyond the circle of light the human moved in stillness, a figure apart, half shadow, half ember, carrying the pale blade of bone across their palms. It felt warm from their touch, as though it had drawn in some quiet heat of its own. They found a small bench near the edge of the hall, where the red light from the fires flickered like distant lightning. The sound of the others filled the space with rhythm and boast, but the human's world had narrowed to the faint glimmer of bone and the whisper of whetstone. They sat again, their back to the wall, their breath slow, their hands sure. There was no teacher here, no command, no watchful eyes, only the work and the silence that carried it. Each motion of the stone against the bone made a sound that was not harsh but steady, a pulse of focus and care. The rasping hum blended with the distant forge song, and for a moment it felt like two hearts beating out of rhythm, one born of fire, one born of patience. The human pressed harder than lighter, feeling the edge sharpen under their will. They paused often to wipe away dust, to trace the line with a fingertip and test the smoothness of the curve. The silence deepened around them, shadows crawling along the walls like slow rivers. The air, cool where the light could not reach it, clung to their skin, to their thoughts. The human breathed it in until it felt like part of their blood. They began to hum, a low sound without melody, just vibration. It merged with the rhythm of their work until bone and hand and air all moved together. At some point they felt another presence, not close but near enough to be sensed. One of the instructors, perhaps moving through the hall, checking progress. Their footsteps were heavy and sure. They passed by the students, giving nods of approval and correction. Their shadows stretched long and dark across the floor and touched the human's feet. The human did not look up. They kept working, the rasping steady, the whisper constant, and when the shadow withdrew, the silence folded back in, as if it had never been broken. The others laughed louder. Now someone had finished their blade and raised it to the fire to test its gleam. The sound of pride carried through the hole, but to the human it was all the echo. They did not envy the brightness, for they had found a different kind of light. Within the hollow of the bone it glowed softly, not from fire but from something older, deeper. It reminded them of moonlight caught in water, a glow that did not burn but endured. They paused once more, lifting the bone blade. So it caught what little firelight reached this far. It shimmered faintly, lines of grain along its surface, catching the red and turning it pale gold, the edge thin and sure. It looked fragile, yet it did not tremble in their grip. They thought of the creature it once was, of the strength that carried it through life, and the stillness that carried it through death, and they knew that both those truths now lived in this blade. The forge roared again as another student cried out in triumph, but the human smiled softly. Their work was nearly done, and though no one had seen them, no one had spoken their name, they felt a strange peace flow through them. The bone was shaped, the silence complete, and the song of the whetstone faded, leaving only the pulse of the hand that held it. The dawn crept over the forge halls, slow and gray light spilling through the vents above, softening the fire glow that had burned all night. The air hung thick with smoke and exhaustion, the scent of metal and ash clinging to every breath. The students, one by one, set down their hammers and straightened their backs, their faces streaked with soot, their hands, raw but proud, laughter rolled between them, tired and triumphant, their blades laid across the anvil, still steaming from their final strikes, each one a symbol of their will and their da. Humans sat apart, the bone blade resting across their knees, pale against the red floor, its smooth curve catching the dim light with a quiet glow. Their hands ached, their fingers stiff with dust, but their eyes were calm. They watched the others gathering around the instructors, waiting for judgment, the sound of pride heavy in their voices as they compared the shine and weight of their steel. When the human rose and began to walk toward them, the laughter faltered just for a breath, then turned sharp and cutting as blades themselves. Some nudged each other and smirked, others whispered behind closed teeth, the sound rising into a mocking chorus. "Where is your blade, human? Where is your fire?" One called, their voice rough with amusement. "Show us what you made out of air." Another laughed louder, a sound like breaking glass. Humans stopped halfway to them. The bone glimmered faintly in the thin morning light. They held it up not as challenge but as truth for a heartbeat. The hall fell still. The others stared. Then the laughter came again, harder, now crueler. "They forged steel while you carved a relic." One set, their eyes bright with derision. "That will crack before it cuts." Another added, swinging their gleaming sword to catch the light. The air filled again with cruel joy, their voices blending into one wild sound that echoed off the stone walls. But the human did not speak. They stood still beneath the haze, their eyes calm, their grip sure. They ran a thumb along the edge of the bone, feeling its fine smoothness, its quiet strength. They had no need to shout, no need to prove, for they could feel the hum beneath the surface, the faint vibration of something that was not. Knowing the instructors approached, the noise dimming under their heavy steps, their faces unreadable. They moved between the students, examining each blade with slow, careful eyes, nodding or frowning. But when they reached the human, they stopped, their gaze falling on the pale weapon. The smallest instructor, with hands scarred by years of work, tilted their head, then crouched to see closer. The whole fell silent, the others waiting to hear the rebuke. They expected, the instructor said nothing for a long moment, only watched the human's hands as they held the bone, then nodded once and stepped back, their voice low. When it came, softer than the forge but clearer than the laughter. "Bring it to the test." The mocking smiles faded, replaced by curiosity and unease. The students whispered again, though now their tones were edged with something that almost sounded like doubt. The human turned and walked toward the testing ground, each step measured and quiet, the bone blade glinting faintly like captured light. The others followed with their shining swords, still hot from the forge. But suddenly they felt the weight of them heavy and uncertain. The air shifted as if the hole itself waited, holding its breath. The human took their place at the center and raised the bone blade. The silence deepened, thick and endless, and in that stillness every sound of laughter vanished, swallowed by the quiet that followed. The hall waited in a hush so deep that even the fires seemed to hold their breath. The forges still glowed along the walls, but their roar had softened into a low murmur like a sleeping beast. The students stood in a wide circle, their blades gleaming in the dim red light, the air thick with pride and doubt and the taste of iron. The instructors stood near the center, motionless, their eyes fixed upon the human who held the bone blade in both hands, as though it were something living. The first student stepped forward, tall and broad, with a horned brow and a grin that showed sharp teeth. They raised their sword high, its surface rippling with the last of the forge heat. The steel looked alive, ready to sing. They swung it downward in a flash of light. The sound rang clear against the air. The instructors nodded, the blade held perfect, its edge untouched. Then they turned their gaze to the human, as if to say, "This is what a blade should be." Human moved closer, the bone blade glimmering faintly against their darkened skin. It caught no firelight, but still, it shone with its own quiet pulse. They said nothing as they raised it, neither challenge nor defiance, only calm. The horned student laughed once, the sound short and rough. "You think that thing will stand against this?" he said. The human did not answer, their eyes steady. The instructor gave a short nod, and the test began. Steel met bong. The sound that followed was not what anyone expected it. It was not the harsh ring of breaking nor the dull crack of failure. It was a note long and low that trembled through the air and settled into the chest of everyone who heard it. The two blades pressed against each other. Sparks leaped and died, but neither broke. The horned student frowned and struck again, harder this time. The note returned deeper still, It echoed through the stone floor, through the anvil racks, through the hollow of every breath, until the hall seemed to hum with it. The laughter was gone, replaced by silence, thick and wary. The human lowered their arm, the bone blade still hold the edge untouched, faint dust of steel marking its surface. The instructor stepped closer, eyes narrowing then widening with something almost like wonder. They ran a fingertip along the bone's curve and drew back. Uncut, the bone hummed faintly as if proud. The others began to murmur, some in disbelief, some in fear, a few in awe. They stared at the weapon that should not have survived, at the human who should not have succeeded. One of them whispered, "It cannot be stronger than steel," and yet the air itself seemed to disagree. For it vibrated still with that note that had silenced their certainty. The instructor turned toward the human, their voice low but steady. "What fire did you use to forge this?" The human met their gaze and spoke for the first time since the task began. "No fire, only time and patience." The words hung there longer than the echo of any hammer strike. The instructors said nothing. The students shifted uneasily as though the floor beneath them had changed shape. The human looked down at the bone blade once more, the edge now gleaming faintly with borrowed light, not born from flame, but from the shaping of stillness. When the instructors finally spoke, their tone held no mockery, no disbelief, only quiet respect. "Each blade holds the will of its maker," they said. "Some burn, some endure, and this one remembers." The human bowed their head, the bone warm in their hands. The others watched in silence. No one laughed, no one spoke, and though the fires still burned along the walls, the brightest light in the hall came from the pale curve of bone that it refused to break. The silence that followed the trial was unlike any that had come before it. Was not the silence of exhaustion, nor the silence that lingered after failure. It was something heavier, deeper. It filled the forge hall until the fires themselves seemed to bow beneath it. The human stood in the center, still holding the bone blade, and the others stood around them, no longer a circle of challengers, but of witnesses. The red light from the forges painted their faces in fading shades of gold and ember, and in every eye there was a flicker of something that was not pride, but understanding. The instructors watched the human without a word. The oldest among them, with hair the color of ash, stepped forward, their eyes bright despite the dim light. They did not take the blade, they only looked at it, and then at the one who had shaped it. Their voice, when it came, was soft but clear, and it carried through the hole like a slow breath. "The steel remembers the forge," they said, "but the bone remembers the body, and perhaps the hand that listens is stronger than the one that strikes." The human said nothing. They lowered their gaze to the bone and felt its weight different. Now, not heavier but truer, as though the air around it had taken notice. They thought of the hours in the shadows, the dust, the scraping sound, the patience it demanded, and the quiet that shaped it more surely than fire. They remembered the laughter, the doubt, the test, and the sound that the blade had sung when it met steel. A note that had not faded. Even now it seemed to hum in their fingers, faint and alive. Around them the students shifted, restless but not mocking anymore. They looked at their own blades, gleaming but cold, the reflections sharp but empty. One by one, they lowered them. Their triumphs now felt smaller, not lesser but quieter. They saw the human and the bone, and something in their faces softened. Maybe it was envy, or maybe respect, or maybe they saw themselves for the first time not as forgers of weapons but as makers of meaning. The oldest instructor turned to the others and nodded. "Once the lesson is complete," they said, "not for the blades but for those who made them," and the sound of their steps as they left echoed through the hall, steady and final. The other instructors followed, speaking low among themselves, their words lost in the hum of cool and stilled. The human remained where they were for a long time. The students drifted away, some pausing to glance back, their faces unreadable, until at last the hall grew empty. Only the dying fires remained there, glow faint and trembling. The human set the bone blade down upon the anvil and watched the light catch on its edge. It gleamed softly like moonlight on still water. They reached out and ran their hand along its curve one last time, feeling not pride but peace. They understood now that creation was not always born from heat or power. Sometimes it came from the quiet that others feared to enter, from listening when all the world demanded noise. The bone had not needed flame, only a hand that dared to hear what waited beneath the surface. Outside the forge, the sky had turned pale with morning, the smoke rising into the wind. The human stepped out carrying the bone blade, wrapped in cloth. The ground cooled beneath their feet, the world washed clean in the new light. They did not know what would come next, whether they would be praised or forgotten, but it no longer mattered, for the truth had already been made, and it was sharp enough to last. They walked until the sound of the forge faded behind them, the rhythm of their steps steady, the weight of the blade gentle against their back, and in that Stillness. The humans smiled, for they knew the lesson had never been about steel or bone, but about the quiet strength of the hand that chose differently, in the silence that gave it form.